Okay, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Professor Alexandra Hui to this colloquium. And she's an associate professor of history at Mississippi State University. And she's been working on the intersection of music and science in fin de siècle Europe and the first half of the 20th century mostly, and she's been publishing extensively of it. And her PhD is from UCLA, and that dissertation became a book, which is the Psychophysical Here, Musical Experiments, Experimental Sounds, 1840-1910, which has been published by MIT Press in 2012. The talk today is listening to nature and standardizing sound, and I understand this is probably part of a new project, so we'll hear more about that in a second. And just before I welcome Professor Hui and I let her take the podium, let me remind you that there is a new play that is starting right now here in Berkeley, and the director is a friend of this center, is Bruce Cogran, and the play is a premiere, which has been just written by Jennifer Blackmer, and is about microphysics. So it's an interesting attempt to bring together theater and physics in some possibly interesting and creative ways. So I'm just encouraging you to go and see it if you can. So please join me in welcoming Professor Hui. I'll give you this. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so no light means that it's on.
Yes.
Well, thank you, certainly to the organizers for inviting me, and then also to all of you for coming. I know this is a busy time of the year, a busy time of the semester, so any audience is great. And this project in particular, as was just mentioned, is the beginning of a new project, and so it's in this nice kind of early stage where feedback is very welcome and very helpful. It's a growth out of, so it sort of started as my contribution to this research group based at the Norwegian University for Science and Technology, NTNU, that this group is called the Cultural Logic of Facts and Figures Research Group. It's funded by the Norwegian Research Council, and it focuses on standardization and measurement and objectification as a social process. And it's mostly anthropologists, but there's some historians of science, I think a media studies person that's part of this. And so this project kind of came out of that. And I'm hoping that it will turn into my third book project. I'm sort of in the middle of my second book project, so which would be something much bigger on how bioacousticians generally listen to nature. So these are not just ornithologists, but then also marine biologists, people that study bugs and bats and vocal species. So again, feedback is very welcome. Historians have in the last decade or so expanded their approach to the past to include sensory experiences, sounds and ways of listening to them, what people heard, what sounds had meaning to them. All of this has been established as an important way to understand the past. And I'm most generally interested in the processes, again, by which these new listening practices were created and then maintained, and then, you know, in some cases, how they decay away. And for this project in particular, I'm quite interested in how experts standardize listening practices for the needs of their disciplines. So this project examines how modern ornithologists and, again, other bioacousticians train themselves and train others to listen to animal sounds. And then further, how they standardize the sound objects that they create through these processes. So I'm looking at the standardization of this community's, very perceptual systems, how these scientists experience the world around them. And I ask what this process of perceptual standardization is and what are, the consequences of it. So birds sound different today than they did 100 years ago. And this is not necessarily, or at least not solely due to bird vocalizations changing over time, but rather because how ornithologists listen has changed over time. So So an example that's slightly biased to prove my point is the bobolink. So it's this bird here. He's kind of unique in the bird world because he wears his jacket backwards. It's open in the front and it's on the other way, like the crisscross of the bird world. And he has a notoriously complicated song. And so descriptions vary from sort of the jolliest, tinkling, rippling, rollicking song that ever issued from a bird's throat to harum-scarum expression of irrepressible joy. More than one ornithologist has said that it's impossible to document his song. Someone else says, well, we need to wait for a better phonograph to be able to record his song. So this is various representations of the bobolink over the last 100 years, right? So of course you have these kind of nonsense, or maybe not, sort of mnemonic phrases. You have music, you have this script here, and then you have these sonograms. And so we can see, in transferring sound to a two-dimensional page that a filtering and a conversion is already clearly occurring, right? There's these disparate and seemingly unrelated forms of representation of the same aural experience. Or is it in fact the same aural experience? So I take this as a departure point, the assumption that how ornithologists listen has changed over time. And so then the question becomes how we might document these perceptual shifts. And this gets a little tricky with ornithologists. While it's quite clear that listening is well integrated into their practice of science, certainly when locating a bird, you usually hear it before you see it. Sometimes you never see it. They don't tend to actually discuss this listening in a really explicit way. And further, until the mass production of records in the early 1930s, ear training really did consist of simply, walking around in the woods, either alone or with someone else that, might be a birder, and listening to the birds, right? And then finding them and being, sort of identifying them for confirmation. So this limits the clues about changes in sensory perception of sound for the historian. There are, sort of trace ways to get at it, though. And so this remains, sort of the graphic and material representations of sound that you find in published material, as well as field notebooks, as well as the actual sound objects. So I'm thinking here of like records, radio shows, things like this, that are achieved through various recording technologies. So very loosely, these are various forms of representation that I found just by surveying, the 20th century in terms of publication about sound. So certainly there's musical language. This is the bobwhite quail. There's the spoken English language. Mnemonic representation. There's a sound representation. Here's the bobolink for you.
Number 12417.
You might be able to hear that he's related to the blackbird. There's also symbolic representation here. I'll talk a bit more about this. And then here again are the sonograms. So again, very loosely, over the 20th century, and this all overlaps and sort of mishmashes. And is that going to be distracting? Let me turn it down. Till it stops. It's a long song too. So today I want to kind of look closely at the 2-decade period at the beginning of the, right here at sort of the first half of the 20th century, and talk about when birdsong was made visual and potentially made material. And this is kind of the lead up to sound recording and bird vocalization through symbolic representation. So I'm going to talk a bit about the sort of last systematic effort to represent bird vocalization with music notation. Do a kind of close examination of some of the field notebooks of the early 20th century. I'm worried if I stop this, it'll navigate away. Okay, bird is silent. I want to talk very briefly about this symbolic representation of Saunders, and I would say that this is kind of the turning point to graphic representation that was explicitly geared towards scientific goals, and sort of talked about in that way. And then very briefly I'll talk about early efforts to record bird vocalizations that was spearheaded by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And again, so these 4 examples are from the first decades of the 20th century, and I think they capture this transition from the kind of jumble of representations that existed before standardization, and then the 2 main objects, this visual notation, and then also the recordings that eventually kind of become the sonograms that are used today. What I think is actually going on perceptually, I go back and forth on having a visual representation of my perceptual model here. Today we're going to do it without a visual representation. What I think is going on perceptually here, both for individuals and then is recapitulated in the birding community more generally, is sort of this series of steps. So first, a sound occurs. Second, the listener processes the sound with their perceptual framework. Third, the listener then represents the sound to themselves and or to others in some form. This could be visually, this could be a recording that they make. Fourth, the process of creating this representation in turn alters the listener's perceptual framework so that next time they hear this sound, which is arguably the same sound, next time it occurs, the listener might actually process it differently, right? Because their perceptual framework has changed. So there's a way in which they're kind of slowly shifting, potentially, their perceptual framework of sound. So to put this into an STS framework, the scientific practice of description and representation informs the creation and standardization of new investigative objects. And this builds on my advisor's concept of materialized epistemology, that image making is knowledge making. Though again, I'm kind of pushing this further, right? I'm arguing that the creation of standardized sound objects does not just create new knowledge, but actually alters the sensual scientist's very perceptual framework. So in the sense, they're standardizing themselves. Okay, so let's start with the musical representation of bird vocalizations. This was not terribly common. Frank Chapman's guide, which is sort of considered the father of the field guides, has only one representation of sound, or of music. In his guide. But this was very appreciated. And this book in particular, Cheney's Woodnotes Wild, a number of ornithologists, Chapman, Ridgway, they claimed that they didn't really have musical enough ears to do this themselves, but they did think this was very important as far as like a contribution to the field. Cheney himself was actually a music instructor. Towards the end of his life, he decided to document all of the sounds of nature. And so this included like water dripping into a bucket and the cows mooing and all of the birds that he could find. So in this sense, he's certainly, he's combining musical and listening expertise, and he's somewhat exceptional in the, the breadth of his goals. But it's well worth examining. Cheney explains that birdsong is music. He presents an origin story of birds that one day in the sort of very distant past stumbled upon the beauty and pleasure of pure musical intervals. And so long before humans, these birds pursued this aesthetic experience, eventually developing their very complicated songs. So this is interesting because it's actually not very different from one of his contemporaries, Charles Darwin, who talks about sexual selection, motoring the co-development of both song in the bird as well as the aesthetic ear in the bird. So Cheney's descriptions of birdsong suggest that birds adhere to the modern Western tuning system. See, they're singing in specific keys. Sometimes they shift around from their tonic to tonic or dominant keys related to their introductory keys. I think we can probably assume that these birds are not actually making these sounds, but I would say in a lot of ways it doesn't really matter. I think we should assume that Cheney was hearing these sounds. He only heard in pure intervals. He could hear the shadings of different keys. He quite clearly believed that the Western tuning system was the universal musical ideal, and that this was the best way to articulate what the birds were doing. So for him, again, this tuning system actually predated Western culture, right? It possibly even predated humankind. The birds were singing it first, because they had sort of happened upon it. So to describe birdsong in terms of the Western tuning system was a circular way of demonstrating both the musicality of the birdsong and the superiority of the Western tuning system. And I would say, it's quite likely that it's circular because he couldn't hear it any other way. Another example is Schuyler Matthews' field books of wild birds and their music. And Matthews was a composer and a watercolorist. He authored several books on trees, wildflowers, and birds. This was the last of kind of a handful of texts that were explicitly devoted to musical representations of bird vocalizations, but it's very popular. I went through several reprintings, I think into the 1940s. It included a quick guide on musical notation, but the complexity of the musical examples that I'll show you in just a second required readers to have a pretty substantial musical background. They needed to be able to see the notes on the page and hear it, kind of in their mind's ear to create the sound experience for themselves from the representation. He described his task in this book as one of a reporter, taking no liberties with the scores or the coloration. There are also a lot of very beautiful illustrations that went with this. And he termed his method scientific, and he sort of says this over and over. And part of this is he's setting himself up in contrast to mnemonic representations of song. He says that they're inadequate. They might help you with rhythm, but they're never going to get the tone of the bird song correctly. Like Cheney, Matthews presented this sort of Darwinian origin story for birdsong, which through habits, associations, imitations of the environment, quote, resulted in the attainment of musical tones at once pleasing to the ear. The bird sings first for love of music and second for the love of the lady, end quote. So there's again this sense in which the bird happens upon the Western scale. Also that the bird sings for his own pleasure and personal aesthetics, which I think is really quite charming. He does go on to note that the bird's song's evolution were unfinished. They often failed to finish on the tonic of their starting key, so there was still like room for improvement for these birds. So I think this is pretty oh, it's kind of fuzzy. Okay. I think this is quite wonderful. This is the yellow-throated vireo, and these are various representations. The first one's actually from Chapman's guide. And so the vireo says, "See me? I'm here. Where are you?" And he's got the music written out. He also has it saying the phrase that he heard, Matthews heard, during the Boer War. And so this is a bunch. This is Mafeking, Motor River, Budawago, Molago, Boer War. So these are all places, sort of specific locations and landmarks related to the Boer War. So he's saying, when you're thinking about the Boer War, you hear the Boer War in the yellow-throated vireo song. He also writes it out here. The bird is apparently singing in chords and in different keys. And he talks about how when the bird, and he says, the bird might shift between keys, certainly, but when it sticks to one key, it sounds like the opening notes of Chopin's Fantasy Impromptu, which we have here. Okay, I don't know how to stop the sound, so we're going to go forward and then go backwards again. So I would read this series of representations as a real effort, certainly to push the reader or listener away from mnemonics, right? He's showing how this is unstable, that you can sort of come up with lots of different mnemonics, that they're maybe a product of their time and place, and instead replace it with musical notation, because he finds this to be more scientific. Despite acknowledging that the keys are sometimes unstable, he's injecting this earworm, right, with the Chopin piece. The Fantasy Impromptu becomes this representation, or becomes a reference for the field. So this is the altered perceptual framework, right? The mnemonic has been dismissed, Chopin has been added. When you hear Chopin in the forest, you know there's a yellow-throated vireo nearby. So interestingly, I think despite trying to represent all birdsong with a rigid notation system that, again, he assumes to be universal and supreme and scientific, Matthews insisted that each birdsong was different. And he's actually quite careful to distinguish between specific birds. And so there's the Campton bird, there's the white mountain bird. he says nature doesn't repeat itself. There's, a variety of soloists, not a vast chorus. He says if anyone debates his documentation, they can come to his house and he'll take them to find the bird. But again, he gives this well-known piece here, the third movement of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. So this is the hermit thrush, apparently. I don't think a bird gets that far. So again, he gives this well-known piece as a reference for the field. Variation between individuals cannot be so significant as to override the reference melody's universal application. I'm not going to dwell on this quote too much. This comes from a 1939. It's not a field guide. This book is 3 to 5 pounds. It's quite big. It's like 8.5 by 11. It's clearly for like learning about birds, not for taking out while looking for them. But I just want to kind of highlight here. He's talking about Forbush and May. They're talking about the mockingbird, and says, he's the greatest musician. He even imitates man's musical inventions. So there's a sense in which, it's not simply the listener that he hears in Western musical intervals, but the bird was actually vocalizing in Western musical intervals. So nature is conforming itself to Western musical intervals. And I think this is, all the way in 1939, I think it's quite interesting that these birders and ornithologists are kind of talking in this way, especially given that the music world is in pretty significant upheaval. And so we have, the active destruction of the traditional Western tuning systems by composers like Schoenberg and Webern, as well as the realization that the non-Western tuning systems exist and are just as sophisticated as Western ones, and perhaps, the Western one is not, in fact, the most perfect and universal. And yet at the same time, I think it sort of indicates how separate ornithology and birding was from kind of the music world, that they're not sort of up on current issues in terms of tuning systems, which is acceptable, I suppose. Okay, so shifting gears and moving forward 10 years, I want to talk a bit about the listening practices in the field. So this is, I want to sort of, especially the notebooks and the writings of the avocational birders Clarence Stone and Verdi Birch that are from Yates County, New York. Stone was a lifelong birder of Branchport. He was born in 1870. He had a position at the Branchport Museum of Natural History. He contributed notes to the Auk and Bird Lore, local newspapers, Bent's Life History of North American Birds. He kept extensive field notebooks and maintained correspondence with a number of birders and ornithologists. He's a very close companion of Verdi Birch, who is from Penn Yan, New York, which is the next stop over on the electric trolley from Branchport. And they'd been birding together since their early 20s. And Birch also wrote notes for the Auk and contributed material to various bird guides. He was one of the early members of the Eastern Bird Banding Association, which I mention only because they have this awesome motto of, "Let us band together." So they would take regular trips together. Sometimes they also had this person, A. Flagg Robinson and J.H. McNaughton. I think they're both doctors, which actually all 4 of these men, their occupations were things other than birding. They weren't ornithologists, but they were deeply committed to birding. They certainly interacted with academic ornithologists, and they were considered to be birding experts in the region. Especially Stone and Birch were very good at identifying rare species, and so that was kind of their specialty. And they would go out, usually in a group, but then they would kind of separate if they were following different birds, and then eventually come back together and talk about it. So here's some kind of representative pages from Stone's field notebooks. He nearly always mentions the sound of the bird when if he's just listing the bird, that's one thing, but if he's describing his day out in the field, he will almost always say that the bird is warbling or screaming. It killdeered vociferously. It can't sing, it just thinks it can. The crows were having a gab fest, so there's a lot of description of sound. The notebooks tend to be sighting lists by species and then descriptions of each field trip. And then he would also index the entire year at the end of it. The first notebook was from 1905 to 1913. Looks like it was written at the end of the day. It's quite tidy. The writing is very neat. And he's gone back through to underline things for indexing. So it's a very sort of carefully thought out notebook. The second notebook from 1913 to 1922 starts to get a little sloppier. There's splashes of ink, there's inconsistent spacing, there's marginalia. So it's suggesting that he's writing more on the fly. And I think it's pretty obvious that he's taking notes in the field. Sometimes there'll be a map or like a silly drawing. So he's got kind of things going on. And so you see this transition in his field practice. In that first notebook, there's only one representation of sound. It's this one of the white-crowned nights, or the white-crowned sparrow. And it's represented with music. In the second notebook, he talks, you start getting a lot of different things, right? You get mnemonics, you get shorthand, and you get music, as musical as the grebe is, which it's not a particularly musical bird. And then in 1920, you get a flurry of musical notation, often combined with mnemonics, clearly written in the field while he's listening to a bird. So I think this is pretty neat. The white-crowned sparrow here. So this is that early one in 1905. So these are different individuals. He's comparing different individuals on the same day. He actually refers back to his 1905 representation and talks about that. Yeah, so the birds are changing keys, so these are different birds. I think, and this is tenuous, but when he's talking about the bird in 1905, see here he says it's translated into music, and then later in the 1920s, the bird is actually saying short, clear series of melodies. So there's this sense in which the bird vocalizations as music have been naturalized. So I'm calling this a music perceptual framework, a crystallization of the perceptual framework into a musical form. The barred owl, this is all mnemonics. You can see something kind of similar happening. Again, there's different individuals that he's talking about here, and he seems to be kind of trying to represent it in different ways. So in October of 1920, he's sort of trying, he's unsure whether he should use the woo, W-H, or the wa, W-U-W, or the who, the sort of H-U-H. And then he sort of settles on hoo-hoo with, two O's here. So, and it becomes quite deliberate, right? By the end, they don't have are there barred owls here? There's barred owls in Mississippi. The mnemonic for it is who cooks for you. So he says, who cooks for you? Who cooks for you? Ah! And he makes this little squawk at the end. So here again, I would say this is, tenuously a crystallization of what I'm calling the hoo-hoo perceptual framework. He settles on hoo-hoo as the best way to mnemonically represent the barred owl. And you see this not just in representations to himself, but also to other people like Birch. So when he writes letters to Birch, he includes music here. Here you can't really see it, but he's describing this one bird. And he's saying, it says pip, 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 pip. And he does this over and over in this really long letter. He keeps saying how this bird is saying pip, pip, pip. And which I think is quite interesting. And you can see how, for Birch, when he's reading Stone's representations, that it allows him to recreate Stone's sound experience for himself, right? So this is maybe a way in which you're transferring some of this listening technique to another individual. And we might ask why. And there's maybe two things, and maybe they're both going on. Birch himself isn't really interested in birdsong. He doesn't really talk about it. He'll talk about the mosses in the trees, and has sort of long descriptions of hemlocks, and he likes the bird. I mean, he'll document the birds that he sees, but he doesn't talk about their song really at all. Another possibility is that this is the only way Stone knows how to describe birds, right? This is his way of understanding birds, is in terms of their sound. So when he's telling somebody about a bird, he has to include a description of their sound. So yeah, and so for birds, I mean, this is the only representation besides, just simply saying that they're singing, is this kind of shorthand graphic notation here. So while I was at Cornell looking at these field notebooks this spring, I was talking to the archivist, this real sort of gem of an archivist, who pointed out, I mean, I wasn't even going to look at the Birch papers, but she mentioned that Birch and Stone would go birding together. And so we had this kind of like light bulb moment where if we perhaps cross-referenced a trip into the field, I might actually be able to find them looking at the same bird. So I spent a very long time looking through these, and I found a couple places where they are in fact referencing the exact same bird, and you get these kind of alternate representations of it. So here's the Tennessee warbler that they both saw on May 20th, and Stone, writes out this mnemonic and has these sort of graphic representation as well. Birch says, Stone saw a Tennessee warbler. In June, on June 20th, Stone sees a Nashville warbler, or hears a Nashville warbler, and he writes out this sort of layered representation, right? He has the graphic representation and he talks about what it is. It's chippy like trills. And Birch just kind of talks about the birds singing. He says, we found this Nashville warbler. He was up in a tree. He was singing a lot. We walked around the tree and then we left. And so he doesn't talk about the song itself at all. And so I think this is kind of neat. It's not really co-construction, but maybe parallel construction of the same sound experience. I'd sort of add that, I mean, other than the discussion of the barred owl in 1921, Stone then, well, they both, sort of stopped talking about bird song, and there's no more graphic representations of bird vocalizations. And I'm not quite sure why there was this kind of flurry and then why it ended. And my thoughts are that it maybe began because he had, read Matthews, a reprinting of Matthews, and kind of caught his fancy. It also seems that 1920 was a period where they were able to spend a lot more time in the field rather than sort of quick trips out in the morning. They would go for several hours. They went to this one place, Old Forge, 4 days in a row. They kept revisiting it. So there's this sense in which they had a more thoughtful engagement with the sights and sounds while they were out there. In terms of why they stop, or certainly why Stone stops using these representational systems, it doesn't really further their goals of documenting birds. The individuals matter, but really only for the sake of counting and identification. So it may simply be that he was kind of dabbling with this and then decided that it wasn't helpful. But again, it's really hard to tell just from when it disappears, because it's not like he's documenting why. Okay, so really quickly, Saunders, 1935 Guide to Birdsong. Saunders, claims that musical notation cannot accurately capture birdsong, and instead talks about his method, and he calls it a musical shorthand, but it's one that he claims accommodates sounds outside the so-called human standards of pitch. And he presents this notation system. They reduce bird vocalizations to 5 characteristics. You have time, pitch, loudness, quality, and phonetics. And then these could then be combined to get things like form, rhythm, accenting, and like other features like slurring here, right? You can sort of get the wood peewees slipping between tones really well. So it's essentially a key of songs with corresponding descriptions of field marks and habitat. So it's a guide, and it's a guide that begins with listening. And then it takes you from listening through the graphic representation to identification. And a lot of the reviewers at the time said that this was actually quite helpful for novices, even those that didn't have trained ears, and certainly those that didn't have musical training, and recommended it as very helpful. So here you have your sort of bound perceptual framework to carry around with you. And I would say this is, indicative of a shift in the representational systems because it is geared specifically towards explicitly scientific goals. These lines that you're going to be drawing in your field notebook, you can compare them, you can measure them, you can analyze them, and towards things beyond identification. So it's not simply a grafting on of a musical system originally intended for human beings, right? And I've talked to a number of ornithologists that actually do this themselves, and they didn't necessarily learn it from Saunders. And so I think there's something kind of intuitive about representing sound in this way. And as I just showed you, there's people doing it before Saunders as well, right? So Stone and Birch both use this. Matthews also had some similar kind of notation in his book. So I think we might think of Saunders as a culmination of a practice or a standardization of a practice rather than an introduction of it. This was not necessarily new news to, I think, a lot of birders at the time. Okay, last example. In 1924, Arthur Allen of Cornell University and his student Peter Paul Kellogg, along with some experts from the engineering school, developed a technique for precision recording of birdsong that used movie tone film. So this is one of the early movie tone films. Here's Arthur Allen with a parabolic reflector. And so they're using movie tone film basically for recording. And so the sound vibrations are converted into light, stored on film, and then they would be reversed for playback. And this technique was further developed by Albert Brand and Peter Keene, who was an undergraduate student who took fiddled with the electrical engineering and added this parabolic reflector that apparently they found in the attic of the physics department. They had been doing some experiments on the applications for tracking enemy aircraft, and they had all these leftover parabolic reflectors. So the nice thing about this was that you could point it at the bird in the field, right? So you don't have to get too close to the bird, nor do you have to capture the bird and hold it in front of a mic, in which case it's not really going to sing for you appropriately. So this was a nice way to get them in their natural habitat, but also isolate it from environmental sounds, which had been the problem up until then. So you get a number of sound products out of this. Albert Brand developed a technique for analyzing the film itself, ultimately transforming measurements into plots of frequency over time. And this is really the foundation of the sonograms that are still used today. Brand argued that individual birdsongs were actually quite similar. And it was the subjective human hearing apparatus that found variation. And so he claimed this film recording technique actually eliminated a lot of this subjectivity. And this is interesting because it's similar language to what the ethnomusicologists had been using probably a generation before. And that this was why it was a superior scientific method, right? Recording eliminated the false variation created by human ears. So if we're talking about new perceptual frameworks, we now have listening through a parabolic reflector and the various recording devices towards a crisp recording for later visual measurement of the resulting film. And it's assumed to be more narrow than the ears suggest, right? So I think there's a sense in which they're looking for some sort of essential sound signature. Other sound products, material forms. You have the very first recordings for public consumption as records and as radio shows. Which probably I should stop here really quickly to discuss ear training more generally. And because bird vocalizations were recorded for mass consumption, this very clearly altered practices. Now, field guides give us some hints. They also correlate to shifting goals and the relative importance of sound for these goals. Chapman's guide, he very clearly talks about the goal is to find the bird. So you listen in order to find the bird, and then when you see the bird, you identify it. So you're not listening for any particular bird, you just want to hear a sound of a bird, and then you go find the bird. So it's really just for location. You don't care about the song at all. Cheney, of course, wants to document all of nature as music because nature was music. So you get this, sort of romantic wandering, through the forest. Saunders is a very focused listening, right? Because he wants to frame everything. The stuff you're interested in, because the stuff that's actually going to frame, your notation, are these 5 characteristics. So you're really, you walk through the forest and you're listening for these 5 features. The Roger Tory Peterson guide, that and the Kreutzmann I'm not really going to talk about more today, but Peterson's guide is considered, absolutely revolutionary in terms of field guide format. And one of the many features that revolutionized it was the checklist for early listing, as well as a number of silhouettes, whether these be flight silhouettes or shore silhouettes. So this is redirecting, I would say, some of the emphasis towards visual experience of the birds and kind of de-emphasizing sound. But he does talk about training your ears, and that it's very important to train your ears, and you need to train with another expert, or you need to practice with records. And he says, you need to do this every night for at least an hour of listening to these bird songs. So the goal is quick field identification, and certainly training will help. And then Kreutzmann has a whole book on sonograms and talks about techniques of listening with the eyes. But he goes through this discussion of a very kind of rigorous training, listening to a mockingbird and taking notes on this bird's song for, an entire hour as this bird is. Mockingbirds just go and go and go and go. But this is all towards, better analysis of sonograms. Certainly there's training records. Recordings, sort of more generally, these are marketed for curiosity as well as training. There's also radio shows. The Cornell Lab of Ornithology had a very popular radio show for a long time. If we talk about this in terms of a materialization process, right, the making of a sound object, you get the separation of the bird from its voice. The record can move around. It can go from room to room. The radio transmits the alarm call of a screech owl over hundreds of miles, possibly during the day. So bird sound objects can now be represented in times and places that were not possible with the actual bird. So here, if we're talking about an altered perceptual framework, you get new listening out of place and time, right? There's a bird on the radio, perhaps one you've never even heard in your region. So there's experiences of species that you have never had before, and you only have it in terms of its sound. Which is not to say that these sound objects, or really sound products, because these are being marketed for mass consumption, were inherently bad. So though there's this reduction of, I guess, birdiness in the form of a flat phonograph or disembodied sounds, and that, I would say that to us today, this seems superior to the alternative of simply shooting the bird, right, and stuffing it and putting it in a drawer. But I would ask, what is being missed if everyone is training from the same training record? And now that technology allows for pocket-sized mobility of bird sound objects, these standardized recordings, so say like the Sibley audio guide, can be reintroduced to the bird. And so I'm referring here to the ethical debate of using bird calls when birding. There's a lot of birders that find this very problematic. It certainly can potentially alter the behavior of birds to hear other bird songs being blasted at them, especially if they use alarm calls. These birds will either become alarmed, which, unnecessarily, or they learn to ignore alarm calls, which is equally bad. We might also think, though, about how this is in fact training birds and what they hear. And so again, the sort of consequences of universalization and representation. So it's not just a question of whether listeners are narrowing their ears by training from some standardized recording, but a question of whether the bird is also learning from the same standardized call. Are we teaching their own call back to them? So then, does this actually sort of complete my feedback loop, I guess is the question. Teaching the bird to sing different as well as the listener to hear different. Oh, I forgot to write out notes for this slide. So yeah, so here I guess is a sort of summarizing the various processes by which sounds are potentially standardized. Certainly you can get through individual practice, whether you're out in the field or you're working with recordings, apprenticing with a superior listener and having them tell you what all these different calls are. Perceptual alterations through the creation and consumption of sound representation. This is most of what I've been talking about today. And also the introduction of previously unheard but already standardized sounds through recording or radio. Okay, so getting back, though, to my final example. In 1935, Cornell and the American Museum of Natural History combined forces for a summer-long expedition across the Southeast to photograph and record disappearing species. So here's Jim Tanner with the parabolic reflector. He's the last person to identify, or to officially identify an ivory-billed woodpecker. And then here's Paul Kellogg working with some of the recording equipment. And they took these amazing photos, really stunning, and some of the earliest and sometimes only recordings of rare species. How does one record the sound of an eastern diamondback rattlesnake? You do it very carefully. And these sound objects, of course, furthered ear training. Firstly, developing and introducing some of the earliest standardized and emblematic bird calls for mass distribution. And I would also say that they furthered conservation awareness. And then we might think of this as a broader perceptual framework, as kind of experience that's sensitive to a vanishing world worth exploring more. This perception of fleetingness. In some cases, again, of course, the materialization of sound corresponds to noticeable silences. And I would say perhaps the saddest consequence, maybe one of the saddest consequences of the separation of the bird from its song through material representation is that for some species, these are the only forms of them that we have left. So this is the only recording of an ivory-billed woodpecker. Just this little squeaking sound. So I'll stop there. Thank you.